Okay, we're now moving into video 2 for APUSH for Tuesday, April 21st, Factories and City Life. Manufacturers cut costs to maximize profits in every way they could imagine. They reduced labor costs by hiring women and children. In cities where most factories were located, manufacturers hired many new arrived immigrants who were anxious for work. Because manufacturers paid as little as possible, the cities in which their employees lived suffered many of the problems associated with poverty, such as crime, disease, and lack of livable housing for a rapidly expanding population. As mentioned before, factories were dangerous, and many families had at least one member who had been disabled at work. Insurance and workmen's compensation did not exist then either. The poverty level in cities also rose because those who could afford it moved away from the city center. As factories sprang up, cities became dirtier and generally less healthy environments. Advances in mass transportation, such as the expansion of railroad lines, streetcars, and construction of subways, allowed the middle class to live in nicer neighborhoods, including bedroom communities in their suburbs, and commute to work. The growing middle class was made up of managers, secretaries, bureaucrats, merchants, and the like. As a result, immigrants and migrants made up the majority of city populations. Starting around 1880, the majority of immigrants arrived from southern and eastern Europe. Prior to 1880, most immigrants to America came from north and western Europe, like Ireland and Germany. Prejudice against the new arrivals was widespread, and many immigrants settled in ethnic neighborhoods, usually in tenements or those very terrible apartment buildings. Worse off still were blacks and Latino migrants. Many employers refused anything but the worst jobs. Municipal governments of the era were not like those of today. In fact, such governments were practically non-existent. Most Americans expected churches, private charities, and ethnic communities to provide services for the poor. However, many of those services were provided instead by a group of corrupt men called political bosses. Bosses helped the poor find homes and jobs. They also helped them apply for citizenship and voting rights. They built parks, funded auxiliary police and fire departments, and constructed road and sewage lines. In return, they expected community members to vote as they were instructed. Occasionally, they also required donations to help fund community projects. Political bosses, whose organizations were called political machines, rendered services that communities would not otherwise have received. However, because these bosses resorted to criminal means to accomplish their goals, the cost of their services were high. The most notorious of these bosses was Boss Tweed of Tammany Hall in New York City. Widespread misery in cities led many to seek changes. Labor unions formed to try to counter the poor treatment of workers. Unions were considered radical organizations by many, and the government was wary of them. Businesses and the courts were openly hostile to them. Hired goons, and in some cases, federal troops often broke strikes. Before the Civil War, the few unions that existed were small, regional, and local, and represented workers within a specific craft or industry. One of the first national labor unions was the Knights of Labor, founded in 1869 by Uriah Stevens, a Philadelphia tailor. The Knights organized skilled and unskilled workers from a variety of crafts into a single union. Their goals included 1, 8-hour workday, 2, equal pay for equal work for men and women, 3, child labor laws, including the prohibition of those working under age 14. Number 4, safety and sanitary codes. Number 5, a federal income tax, not enacted until the ratification of the 16th Amendment, 1913. And 6, government ownership of railways and telegraph lines. Although the Knights advocated arbitration over strikes, they became increasingly violent in efforts to achieve their goals. By the 1880s, after a series of unsuccessful strikes under the leadership of Terence Patterly, the popularity of the Knights began to decline. The American public began to associate unions with violence and political radicalism. Propagandists claimed that unions were subversive forces, a position reinforced in public opinion by the Haymarket Square riot. During the 1886 labor demonstration in Chicago's Haymarket Square, a bomb went off, killing police. Many blamed the incident on the influence of radicals within the union movement, although no one knew who set the bomb off. Many early unions did indeed subscribe to utopian or socialist philosophies. Later on, the American Federation of Labor, led by Samuel Gompers, avoided those larger political questions, concentrating instead on such bread and butter issues as higher wages and shorter workdays, an approach that proved successful. Gompers also realized that his union could gain more power if it excluded unskilled workers. The AFL was formed as a confederation of trade unions, i.e., unions made up of exclusively workers within a single trade. The history of early unions is marred by the fact that most refused to accept immigrants, blacks, and women among their membership. Charitable middle-class organizations, usually run by women, also made efforts at urban reform. These groups lobbied local governments for building safety codes or better sanitation in public schools. Frustrated by government's slow pace, their members also founded and lived in settlement houses in poor neighborhoods. These houses became community centers, providing schooling, childcare, and cultural activities. In Chicago, for example, Janie Addams founded Hull House to provide such services as English lessons for immigrants, daycare for children or working mothers, childcare classes for parents, and playgrounds for children. Addams also campaigned for increased government services in the slums. She was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for her life's work in 1931. While the poor suffered, life improved for both the wealthy and middle class. Increased production and wealth meant greater access to luxuries and more leisure time. Sports, high theater, vaudeville, and later movies became popular diversions. It was also during this period that large segments of the public began to read popular novels and newspapers. The growth in the newspaper industry was largely the responsibility of Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst, both of whom understood the commercial value of bold, screaming headlines and lurid tales of scandal. This new-style sensational news reporting became known as yellow journalism. Okay, we get a little bit into Jim Crow laws and we'll stop for the day. So Jim Crow laws in the South. Most of the advances made during the machine age affected primarily northern cities. In the South, agriculture continued as the main form of labor. The industrialization programs of Reconstruction did produce some results, however. Textile mills sprang up around the South, reducing cotton farmers' reliance on the North. Tobacco processing plants also employed some workers. Still, the vast majority of Southerners remained farmers. Post-war economies forced many farmers to sell their lands, which wealthy landowners bought and consolidated into larger farms. Landless farmers, both black and white, were forced into sharecropping, the method by which they rented land called the crop lien system. It was designed to keep the poor in constant debt. Because these farmers had no cash, they borrowed what they needed to buy seed and tools, promising a portion of the crop as collateral. Huge interest rates on their loans and unscrupulous landlords pretty much guaranteed that these farmers would never overcome their debt, forcing them to borrow further and promise their next crop as collateral. In this way, landlords kept them poor, both black and white, in a state of virtual slavery. The advent of Jim Crow laws made matters worse for blacks. As the federal government exerted less influence over the southern states, towns and cities passed numerous discriminatory laws. The Supreme Court assisted the states by ruling the 14th Amendment did not protect blacks from discrimination by privately owned businesses, and the blacks would have to seek equal protection from the states, not from the federal government. In 1883, the court also reversed the Civil Rights Act of 1875, thus opening the door to legal or de jure segregation. In 1896, the Supreme Court ruled in Plessy v. Ferguson that separate but equal facilities for the different races was legal. In doing so, the court set back the civil rights gains made during Reconstruction. In this atmosphere, integration and equal rights for blacks seemed to most a far-off dream. Booker T. Washington certainly felt that way. A Southern black born into slavery, Washington harbored no illusions that white society was ready to accept blacks as equals. Instead, he promoted economic independence as a means by which blacks could improve their lot. To pursue that goal, he founded the Tuskegee Institute, a vocational and industrial training school for blacks. Some accuse Washington of being an accommodationist because he refused to press for immediate equal rights. Others believe that Washington simply accepted the reality of his time that he set his goals to. In his Atlanta Exposition speech, a famous speech delivered in Atlanta, Georgia, in 1895, Washington outlined his view of race relations. Washington's more aggressive rival, W.E.B. Du Bois, referred to the speech, which he deemed submissive, as the Atlanta Compromise. All right, let's go look at the key concepts real quick. All right, I'm finishing up Unit 5 in the course guidebook. On topic 5.11, failure of Reconstruction. Southern plantation owners continued to own the majority of the region's land even after Reconstruction. Former slaves sought land ownership but generally fell short of self-sufficiency, as an exploitive and soil-intensive sharecropping system limited blacks and poor whites to access to land in the South. Segregation, violent Supreme Court decisions, and local political tactics progressively stripped away African American rights, but the 14th and 15th Amendments eventually became the basis for the court decisions upholding civil rights in the 20th century. Okay, so 5.12 is comparison or the review portion of Unit 5. Unit 6, looking at 6.2. Western expansion, not there yet. Or 6.2. Looking at 6.4, the New South. The development and debates about democracy, freedom, and citizenship, and diversity in individual and shape American and national identity, cultural values, and beliefs about American exceptionalism. In turn, those ideas shape political institutions and society. Throughout American history, notions in national identity and culture have coexisted with varying degrees or regional group identities. Despite the industrialization of some segments of the Southern economy, a change promoted by Southern leaders, also called the New South, agriculture based on sharecropping and tenant farming continue to be the primary economic activity in the South. The Supreme Court decision in Plessy v. Ferguson that upheld racial segregation helped to mark the end of most of the political gains African Americans made during the Reconstruction. Facing increased violence, discrimination, and scientific theories of race, African American reformers continue to fight for political and social equality. And that's going to end video 2 for us there.